The last morning Madeline Soto was seen alive did not begin with urgency or alarm. It began the way countless school mornings begin across Central Florida, quiet, rushed, and deceptively ordinary. A teenage girl prepared for what was supposed to be another weekday, moving through a familiar routine shaped by family schedules and shared spaces. There were no signs, at least none that would immediately register as danger, that this routine would become the final chapter of her life. When Madeline failed to return home, concern set in quickly. Her absence did not fit her habits. She was young, dependent on adults for transportation, and closely tied to her daily schedule. By that evening, worry hardened into fear, and authorities were notified. What initially appeared to be a missing child case tragic, but not uncommon, would soon unfold into a prolonged investigation marked by contradictions, shifting stories, and a growing realization that the truth was buried not somewhere far away, but disturbingly close to home. From the outset, investigators relied heavily on the accounts provided by Madeline's immediate family. Her mother and her mother's boyfriend, Stephen Stearns, became the primary sources of information about Madeline's last known movements. They described a morning in which Madeline was allegedly dropped off near her school. The explanation sounded plausible, even mundane. Children are dropped off every day. But as detectives would later learn, plausibility is not the same as truth. Early interviews revealed subtle inconsistencies. Times did not align perfectly. Descriptions of locations varied slightly, depending on who was speaking and when. At first, these discrepancies could be dismissed as stress-induced confusion. After all, families under extreme emotional strain often misremember details. But as hours turned into days, the inconsistencies multiplied instead of settling into a coherent timeline. Law enforcement began reconstructing Madeline's final hours minute by minute. Surveillance footage from nearby roads and businesses was reviewed. School attendance records were checked. Transportation routes were analyzed. One critical fact emerged quickly and decisively. Madeline never arrived at school that day. No teacher saw her. No classmate spoke to her. No camera captured her entering campus grounds. The cornerstone of the family's initial account began to crumble. As investigators pushed back with this information, the narrative subtly shifted. Details were revised. Times were adjusted. Small corrections were offered, each one seemingly insignificant on its own. But together, they painted a troubling picture, one in which the adults responsible for Madeline's care were not simply mistaken, but possibly withholding information. Public appeals intensified. Madeline's face appeared on news broadcasts and social media feeds across the country. Her age and vulnerability drew immediate sympathy. The fact that she was last seen under the supervision of family members only deepened public concern. Viewers were not just asking where Madeline was, they were asking how a child could vanish without leaving a clear trail. Behind the scenes, detectives began focusing less on distant possibilities and more on the household itself. Family members were re-interviewed separately. Statements were compared line by line. Investigators noted changes in tone and emphasis, especially when questions touched on the exact sequence of events that morning. The closer the questions came to the home, the more strained the answers became. Stephen Stearns, the mother's boyfriend, emerged as a central figure in the timeline. He had been one of the last people with Madeline. He offered explanations confidently at first, repeating versions of events that placed responsibility elsewhere: traffic, timing, misunderstandings. Yet digital evidence told a quieter, more reliable story. Cell phone data, location records, and surveillance footage did not support his account. The gap between what was said and what could be proven widened with each passing day. Meanwhile, Madeline's mother faced her own scrutiny. Investigators examined not only what she said, but what she did not say. Her statements often echoed those of Stearns, sometimes too closely. Detectives began to question whether loyalty, fear, or denial was shaping her cooperation. In cases involving family members, emotional bonds can complicate truth-telling, and investigators are trained to recognize when protection replaces transparency. As the investigation stretched on, frustration grew both within law enforcement and among the public. Vigils were held. Strangers left flowers and stuffed animals, gestures of mourning for a child they had never met. Online discussions turned increasingly critical of the adults involved. The question who last saw her became more pointed. The assumption that danger comes from outside began to feel less certain. Then came the moment that changed the tone of the case entirely. Investigators announced that they no longer believed Madeline was simply missing. Evidence suggested foul play. This shift reframed every earlier statement, every delayed answer, every inconsistency. What had once been viewed through the lens of hope was now examined through suspicion. Law enforcement efforts intensified. Search areas expanded. Forensic teams were brought in. The investigation moved from recovery to accountability. Detectives made it clear they believed Madeline's disappearance was not an accident and not the work of a stranger. It was a result of actions taken by someone who knew her, someone trusted with her safety. For those following the case, the emotional weight became heavier. A missing child case carries the fragile hope of reunion. A homicide investigation carries grief, anger, and an irreversible sense of loss. The transition between the two is devastating, especially when the evidence points inward toward the very people meant to protect. By the end of this first phase, one truth had become unavoidable. The answers did not lie in random sightings or distant tips. They lay in the unraveling of a family narrative built on half-truths and omissions. Madeline Soto had not vanished into the world. She had been lost within and inside a circle of adults whose stories could no longer withstand scrutiny. The case was no longer about finding a missing girl. It was about exposing how she was failed, step by step, by those closest to her, and how long it took for the truth to surface. As investigators turned inward, the Soto household became the focal point of an inquiry that grew heavier with each passing day. What had once been treated as a cooperative family searching for a missing child was now examined as a closed system one, where every relationship, dependency, and emotional bond mattered. Detectives understood that when a child disappears under the care of family, the truth is rarely hidden by distance. More often, it is buried beneath routine, trust, and the quiet protection of familiarity. The reconstruction of Madeline's final days began with a deeper examination of her home life. Friends, classmates, teachers, and extended relatives were interviewed, not just to establish her movements, but to understand her emotional world. Who did she trust? Who did she confide in? Had she expressed fear, discomfort, or distress? These questions are critical in cases involving minors, especially when the last known contacts are adults with authority over them. Gradually, a more complex picture emerged. Madeline was described as vulnerable young, impressionable, and reliant on the adults around her. Investigators noted that her daily life was tightly structured around her household. This meant that any disruption to her routine would almost certainly involve someone within that environment. The possibility that she had simply walked away or encountered danger on her own became increasingly implausible. Attention centered on Stephen Stearns, who lived with Madeline and her mother and played a daily role in Madeline's life. Stearns had positioned himself early on as a helpful figure, offering explanations and presenting himself as cooperative. But cooperation, detectives know, can sometimes be performative. What mattered was not how willing he seemed, but whether his words aligned with objective evidence. As interviews continued, Stearns' statements revealed subtle but significant shifts. Small details, exact times, routes taken, brief interactions changed from one retelling to the next. These were not dramatic contradictions, but they were persistent. In homicide investigations, especially those involving children, it is often the accumulation of minor inconsistencies that exposes a larger deception. Investigators also scrutinized Madeline's mother, whose role was emotionally and legally complex. She was both a grieving parent and a potential witness to critical information. Her statements frequently mirrored those of Stearns, sometimes repeating the same phrasing, the same explanations. Detectives questioned whether this alignment was a result of shared memory or shared agreement. In cases involving intimate partners, loyalty and denial can blur the line between truth and protection. The dynamics inside the household raised additional concerns. Who had authority? Who made decisions? Who controlled schedules and movements? These questions are not speculative, they're essential in understanding opportunity and access. The more investigators examined the family structure, the clearer it became that Madeline's world was small and that the people within it wielded enormous influence over her safety. Digital evidence became a turning point. Cell phone records, location data, and electronic activity provided a timeline that could not be emotionally adjusted or reinterpreted. Technology does not forget. When compared against verbal accounts, these records highlighted gaps that could no longer be explained away as stress or confusion. Investigators saw moments where claimed movements did not match recorded locations, and time frames that simply did not add up. Confronted with these discrepancies, the tone of interviews shifted. Questions became more direct. Follow-ups were sharper. Detectives pressed for clarity, not comfort. In response, explanations grew more complicated rather than more precise, a red flag in investigative psychology. Truth tends to simplify under pressure. Lies require constant revision. At the same time, law enforcement expanded its inquiry beyond the immediate household. Past behavior, prior incidents, and patterns of interaction were examined. Investigators looked for signs of grooming, control, or secrecy behaviors that often precede harm to a child. While much of this work remained confidential, it informed the direction of the case, narrowing focus rather than widening it. Publicly, the family continued to appeal for Madeline's return. These appearances were carefully watched not for emotion, but for consistency. Investigators are trained to separate grief from performance, to note when statements emphasize certain details while avoiding others. The public, too, began to notice. Sympathy gradually mixed with skepticism as viewers questioned why key facts remained unresolved. Behind closed doors, detectives were building a case not on a single revelation, but on a pattern of access, opportunity, and deception. The longer Madeline remained missing, the less plausible innocence became for those closest to her. In cases involving children, time is cruel. The absence of answers becomes an answer in itself. As the investigation progressed, law enforcement made it clear that the family was no longer simply assisting, they were central to the inquiry. This shift carried legal and emotional consequences. Trust between investigators and the household eroded. Conversations became guarded. Legal counsel entered the picture. The search for Madeline had become a search for accountability. For the public, this phase of the case was deeply unsettling. The idea that a child could disappear not because she wandered into danger, but because danger lived with her, strikes at a fundamental sense of security. It forces a painful reckoning that the systems meant to protect children, family, routine, trust can also be the spaces where they are most vulnerable. By the end of the second stage, investigators were no longer asking if the truth would emerge, but when. The family narrative had fractured under scrutiny. What remained was a growing body of evidence pointing inward, toward decisions made in private and lies told in desperation. Madeline Soto's story was no longer just about loss. It was about betrayal and the slow, methodical work required to expose it. By the time investigators entered the third phase of the case, the search for Madeline Soto had transformed into something far more precise and unforgiving. This was no longer a question of confusion or miscommunication. It was a process of elimination, testing every claim against evidence that could not be persuaded, intimidated, or emotionally manipulated. What emerged was a pattern that law enforcement recognizes all too well. Deception layered carefully over time, each lie designed to protect the one before it. Digital evidence became the backbone of this stage. Phone data, vehicle movements, and time-stamped records provided a silent but relentless account of events. While statements from the household continued to shift, the data remained fixed. Investigators mapped timelines down to the minute, comparing where individuals said they were with where their devices placed them. The discrepancies were no longer subtle. They were structural, undermining the entire version of events presented in the early days of the investigation. Stephen Stern's account faced the greatest strain. His explanations for Madeline's last known movements conflicted repeatedly with location data and surveillance footage. Routes he claimed to have taken did not match recorded travel paths. Times he insisted upon could not be reconciled with electronic records. Each contradiction forced investigators to ask a more difficult question. If these details were wrong, what was being concealed? Detectives confronted Stearns with these inconsistencies in formal interviews. Such confrontations are not designed to provoke confessions, but to observe behavior under pressure. Investigators noted defensiveness, selective memory, and a tendency to deflect responsibility. When asked to clarify specifics, answers became vague or overly complex. This response pattern over explanation without resolution is often associated with intentional deception rather than genuine confusion. Attention also returned to Madeline's mother, whose role grew increasingly painful and ambiguous. Investigators examined her awareness of events, her reliance on Stearns' version of the timeline, and her responses when confronted with contradictory evidence. In cases involving children, caregivers sometimes cling to false narratives because accepting the truth would mean acknowledging catastrophic failure, both personal and moral. Detectives considered whether denial was shaping her cooperation or whether something more deliberate was at play. Forensic efforts intensified. Searches expanded based on evolving timelines and newly analyzed data. Investigators followed leads not because they expected them to succeed, but because each failed lead narrowed the field further. The absence of evidence in certain locations became as meaningful as its presence elsewhere. Every step eliminated alternatives and brought the investigation closer to an unavoidable conclusion. Meanwhile, public patience wore thin. The extended investigation, combined with a lack of transparency inherent to active cases, fueled speculation and outrage. Commentators questioned why it had taken so long to identify clear responsibility. Law enforcement, however, moved deliberately. In cases built on circumstantial and digital evidence, precision matters. A rushed conclusion risks collapse in court. Investigators were not just seeking answers, they were building a case that could withstand scrutiny. As pressure mounted, the psychological toll became evident. Interviews grew more tense. Statements shortened. Cooperation became conditional. The once unified household narrative splintered further, revealing fractures that could no longer be smoothed over. Investigators recognized this stage as critical, when lies begin to contradict each other faster than they can be maintained. Eventually, the evidence converged, not in a single dramatic revelation, but in a cumulative realization that the truth had been present all along, obscured by delay, denial, and deliberate misdirection. The data told a story of control and opportunity, of a child whose fate was decided not by chance, but by the actions of someone entrusted with her care. For those working the case, the emotional weight was immense. Crimes against children carry unique gravity, especially when prolonged deception compounds a harm. Each false statement was not just an obstruction of justice, it was time stolen from a child who could no longer speak for herself. By the end of this phase, investigators had moved beyond suspicion. They had evidence, timelines, and a clear understanding of how the truth had been obscured. What remained was the final step: accountability. The question was no longer what happened to Madeline Soto. It was how the system would respond to the betrayal that led to her death. The final stage of the Madeline Soto case did not arrive with sudden clarity or dramatic closure. It arrived the way many long, painful investigations do quietly, through confirmation rather than revelation. By this point, law enforcement was no longer assembling fragments. They were aligning conclusions. The question of what had happened was no longer open. What remained was a heavy task of assigning responsibility, and of confronting the consequences of a child's life ending within the walls meant to protect her. As evidence solidified, investigators narrowed their focus decisively. The overlapping timelines, digital records, and inconsistent statements had reached a point where alternative explanations could no longer survive scrutiny. What had once been presented as confusion was now clearly recognized as obstruction. What had been framed as stress was understood as strategy. The lies were not random. They had direction, purpose, and persistence. Stephen Stearns became the central figure of accountability. Investigators concluded that his access to Madeline, combined with a falsified timeline and digital contradictions, placed him at the core of the crime. The case against him was built methodically not on emotion, but on proof. In cases involving children, prosecutors understand that outrage alone is not enough. Every charge must rest on evidence strong enough to speak for a victim who cannot testify. For Madeline's mother, the reckoning was different but no less devastating. While the legal focus centered on Stearns, investigators also examined the failures that allowed the crime to occur and the delays that followed. Her role was scrutinized not only in terms of what she did, but what she failed to question, failed to notice, or failed to act upon. In cases like this, accountability extends beyond a single individual. It reaches into the systems of trust that collapse silently, long before a crime is discovered. The public response was intense and deeply emotional. Many felt anger not just at the crime itself, but at the prolonged deception that followed. The idea that precious time had been lost to lives was particularly painful. Each delayed truth felt like a second betrayal of Madeline, compounding the original harm. For families watching from afar, the case struck a nerve because it challenged a fundamental belief that home is safe. Legal proceedings moved forward with caution and gravity. Prosecutors emphasized the evidence trail, knowing the defense would scrutinize every detail. This was not just a case about guilt, it was a case about credibility. The digital records, the contradictions, the pattern of deception all formed a narrative that no longer relied on any single statement. The truth stood on its own. As the case reached this stage, Madeline's name took on a different weight. She was no longer only a missing child or a victim of a single crime. She became a symbol of how easily warning signs can be overlooked, how trust can be misused, and how accountability often arrives too late to save the innocent, but not too late to matter. For investigators, the end of the case did not bring relief. It brought a quiet reckoning. Crimes against children leave lasting marks on those who investigate them, precisely because the outcome is irreversible. There is no restoration, only responsibility. The goal becomes ensuring that the truth is fully told, and that the failure to protect is not buried alongside the victim. Madeline Soto's story is not defined by how she died, but by what her case revealed. It exposed how lies can delay justice, how family dynamics can shield harm, and how a child can disappear not because no one was watching, but because the wrong people were trusted. Her case forces uncomfortable questions about vigilance, denial, and the cost of looking away. In the end, accountability was not about punishment alone. It was about acknowledgement. Acknowledgement that Madeline deserved safety, that she deserved honesty, that she deserved to be believed and protected long before investigators were called. The legal system could address the crime, but it could not undo the silence that allowed it to happen. Madeline's story remains a warning and a responsibility, a reminder that the most dangerous lies are often told calmly, repeatedly, and close to home, and that justice, when it finally arrives, carries not only answers but the weight of everything that failed before it did.